So I'm Jayme Luna.
I'm Katrina Conen.
In collaboration with Dr. Bachet, Dr. Glassmeyer, and Dr. Terrace-Gabbage, we studied the impact of using raw versus uniform T-scores. Today we're going to call the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory to restructured form, MMPI-2RF. How many here have ever taken a standardized test such as the AP test, the GRE, or... As you can see, it's very common to take these tests, and each of these tests have been studied in depth so that those relying on the results of the test can know that the results are going to be accurate and meaningful. Another widely researched test is the MMPI-2RF. Mental health clinicians use psychological assessment tools when assessing clients' mental health status and the severity of symptoms. The MMPI-2RF is a 338-item self-report measure with 42 scales that assesses personality and psychopathology dysfunction. And it can be used in clinical settings and other settings like forensics. Let's talk about what raw and uniform T-scores are. So raw scores are taken when responses on the subsets of items for the scales, and then those scores are used to calculate the specific raw score. So the number of items that are endorsed in a key direction for a scale gives that specific scale the raw score. Now standardized scores, going back to our standardized tests, they start off with the raw scores, and then the scores are translated, interpreted into standardized scores. And it aids in the interpretation of results. The IQ test, for example, has a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15 in a general population, and it allows the comparison of differences between different scores to see the person's extreme score. Now, uniform T-scores are an alternative standardized score, and it's specific to the MMPI family of tests. This specific test has a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10 in the general population, and because not a lot of extreme psychological symptoms are endorsed, dysfunction is endorsed, there tends to be a positive skew to how the results are in the spread. Uniquely, uniform T-scores go through a smoothing process which ensures the same distributional shape across these different scales. And it allows us to compare the severity level for each across these various scales, and it allows these scores to be comparable to the general population. It got cut off, but say this is score distributions for anxiety, and this is score distributions for a depression scale, and this is the score distributions for a psychotic scale, and this is the uniform T distributions. Taking the average score of each of these scales, it creates this unique same distributional shape, and allows it to be compared at a severity level of 65T, with 120T being the maximum. This gives you an outline of the general scores across. Yes. And this area is where we're going to focus on today. And this is the more severe end of the scale. Katrina will explain our current study.
So for our current study, we wanted to study the impact of using raw versus uniform T-scores because researchers generally use raw scores when conducting studies, and clinicians use uniform T-scores when interpreting results from their clients. As far as we know, a head-to-head comparison of raw and uniform T-scores has not yet been conducted. For the MMPI-2RF, we obtained IRB approval of the state of California, and Jayme and I interpreted results and read relative literature. So we used de-identified archival scores and diagnoses of 764 inpatients at the Forensic State Hospital. These patients were committed for reasons such as incompetency to stand trial, insanity at the time of offense, were transferred from a prison for psychiatric treatment, or were civilly committed mentally disordered offenders or mentally disordered sex offenders. Most of the patients were living with severe psychological illnesses such as schizophrenia disorders, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, substance abuse, and antisocial personality disorder. Our data specifically looked at the higher order scales and restructured clinical or RC scales. So the internalizing disorder scales are designed to measure depressive, anxious, and phobic symptoms. The thought disorder scales are designed to measure psychotic symptoms like schizophrenia-related disorders, and externalizing disorder scales are designed to measure impulsivity, antisocial behavior, and substance abuse. It's got cut off. But we use descriptive statistics like mean, standard deviation, skewness, and kurtosis. And to the left of the screen, you can see examples of skewness with no skew, some positive skew, and notable positive skew. And then to the right, you can see leptocritic, mesocritic, and platycritic. And we predicted uniform T-scores would have a less normal distribution than raw scores. We also used inferential statistics like point by serocorrelations and scale intercorrelations. And so to the left, we have scale intercorrelations with no association, modest positive association, and strong positive association. And we hypothesized that raw scores would have a slightly stronger scale intercorrelations than uniform T-scores. And then to the right, you have point by serocorrelations with no association, some positive association, and modest positive association. And we predicted raw scores would have somewhat stronger correlations with relevant psychiatric diagnostic criteria. So for our results, with this graph, we have raw scores on the bottom and uniform T-scores on the top. And we saw strong scale intercorrelations with correlations ranging from 0.97 to 1.0. On this graph, you have raw scores highlighted in blue and uniform T-scores highlighted in white. So for skewness and kurtosis, we saw that raw scores were slightly more positively skewed and leptocritic than uniform T-scores in the internalizing and thought dysfunction scales. And for the externalizing scales, the pattern wasn't as clear, but uniform T-scores were slightly more platycritic than raw scores. And for point by serocorrelations, there was some positive association excuse me, in regards to relevant diagnostic criteria. So for scale intercorrelations, 4 of the 12 scale intercorrelations were slightly stronger for raw scores than uniform T-scores, and those were found in internalizing and thought dysfunction scales. So remember, we wanted to study this because researchers generally use raw scores and clinicians use uniform T-scores. And we found that skewness and kurtosis values were higher for raw scores, which indicates a greater non-normality of distributions. So because of our results, we suggest that researchers use uniform T-scores in the future, but studies that were done in the past using raw scores is still applicable to a general clinical setting. A limitation of this study was that we used a very specific sample, being psychiatric forensic inpatients. And so for future studies, we suggest replication with a wider variety of external criteria. We'd like to thank our funding sources with the University of Minnesota Press and CSUMB's Undergraduate Research Opportunity Center. Thank you. Any questions?
So I'm interested in your sample and how it is a very particular sample. How do you think your results might be different if you used a more typical sample or a non-clinical sample?
It would be more like the general, like normalized curve. We just focused on the tail end of the generalized distribution. Mm-hmm. So that's why our results were a little bit more extreme. But I think if we used a more general, like, clinical sample, it would be closer to the normalized curve.
And I'm wondering if it would be generalized if they were inpatient as opposed to outpatient. That would be another interesting
Yeah, that would be really
population to
interesting.
study. Yeah. Good job.
Thank you. Yeah.
People use the test to get out of trials by pleading clinical insanity.
I don't think that's very common, but it's possible.
They've got validity scales and other scales within the test to kind of catch that type of thing to make sure that there's not invalid responding.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Katrina and Jayme.